part of what we call an EU2U series. The 2U implying that we go out into the community and we meet different community partners and on their turf, on their time, to discuss topics that they feel are interesting. Traditionally, we've done most of these with educational communities. We've done a lot with K-12 and community colleges. This is actually the first EU2U session that we've done specifically with businesses. So we're really, or business leaders, so we're really happy to be doing that. And in planning this session, one of the things that came up was that we thought it best to have actual practitioners, business leaders and government leaders to talk to you. We certainly do have more academic resources if you want a full-fledged dissertation or data for days on Brexit and voting trends. We have plenty of that, but we felt that what would serve you best is to have different business leaders offer their perspectives on Brexit. What are the big focuses of the negotiations coming up? I would like to put a disclaimer out there that our goal of this is not to explain the entirety of Brexit as a political phenomenon in 1 hour. I don't think anybody really can, and I don't want to put our panelists up to that because that's quite a task. But we do want to give you all some information about moving forward, what to look at in the Brexit negotiations. We have different levels of knowledge coming in, and I've essentially designed a few questions and topics that I'm going to have them talk about based on some of the interest points that you all provided when you signed up, if you did. And then, as Katie said, we'll cut off for some Q&A. And to briefly reintroduce our panel, we have Garrett Workman from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. We have Orla O'Hannaidh from Womble Dickson Bond. I still want to say Womble Carlo. And we also have Andrew Terrell with the UK Special Government Office here, located with the, not this office, the Raleigh office. And I'll let them.
North Carolina. It's okay. I don't want to get Raleigh, Charlotte, the Triangle, too much competition.
Exactly. So I'm going to let them elaborate on their bios a little bit more, and also I've asked them for the first question to sort of identify what they think is really at stake with the Brexit negotiations, and I've told them they could answer that from either a professional or a personal standpoint, what they really think are the linchpins in the negotiation, what is most important at this point to look at. So do you want to start maybe at this end, Garrett? Are you willing to start?
Sure, that's fine.
Thanks.
So hi everyone. As everyone has said, I'm Garrett Workman at the U.S. Chamber. Thanks to UNC and to everyone here for being here and for hosting us. I am the Director of European Affairs at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. We humbly refer to ourselves as the world's largest business association. We represent the interests of over 3 million companies of all sizes and sectors, including, I know, some of the companies here in the room are members of ours. We obviously sit in Washington right across the park from the White House, so have a little bit of a front row seat into all the things going on in our capital right now, and obviously an interesting time with the midterms coming up and everything else. But since I focus specifically on Europe, I've been at the Chamber for 3 years, so we've gone through this process of a US-EU free trade agreement, which included the UK, and now we're sort of transitioning to a different kind of relationship, obviously, with both the EU and the UK separately as a result of the UK's referendum and vote to leave the European Union at the end of March of next year. In the aftermath of that referendum, the Chamber set up something called the US-UK Business Council, which you might have seen a little handout for outside. We have, I think, 15 now bilateral business councils at the Chamber focusing specifically on bolstering economic and trade ties between the United States and that particular country. It's our only one in Europe because mostly our work is actually focused at the EU level, but now we have the EU and the UK. As I'm sure most of you know, the UK is obviously a significant destination and originator of investment in the US and vice versa. In fact, the US has about a quarter of its overall investments in Europe in the UK. A lot of that was made with an eye towards accessing the broader EU single market, which is one of the reasons that we're obviously so interested in how Brexit plays out, and particularly in the future relationship between the UK and the EU. You might have seen I have a handout of some data points, but the UK has invested over $480 billion in the United States, which is more than 15% of all FDI into our country. We have invested over $600 billion into the UK, which is our largest investment destination. It's more than 12% of all of our FDI worldwide. And every day, more than 1 million people go to work in the United States for British firms and vice versa. So it's a huge direct relationship already, one that we obviously want to see continue to flourish into the future. And we are very committed to, no matter how Brexit turns out, making sure that the US and UK have a continued strong economic and political partnership. Obviously not my direct forte, but the foreign policy and the security ties are going to be there and remain strong. We have, obviously, it's a very special relationship that we want to continue to provide, which provides benefits for all of us, and we want to continue that. I think just to say, I meant to say this in the beginning, I also have a personal connection to the region after going to the UNC TransAtlantic Masters Program here at Carolina, as Facebook helpfully reminds me, a decade ago at this point. So I was seeing some pictures from Halloween on Franklin Street, and it was a nice time to come back to this area, and obviously it's a beautiful time of the year, so thank you for spending some of your afternoon with us. But I want to just a little bit about why the US business community is so concerned, frankly, with the continued uncertainty that we see with Brexit. I think the main thing that at this point businesses are like, okay, we're still pretty sure this is actually going to happen. We could talk about, there's still some scenarios potentially where people in the news will talk about a second referendum. I think that's fairly unlikely, very unlikely in fact. The politics in London are obviously, much like in Washington, very frayed at the moment. There's really not much of a majority for any future relationship or any version of Brexit, which is a difficult situation. I have a lot of empathy for the Prime Minister, who's in a position where she supported staying in the EU and is now being asked to deliver an agreement with the EU that allows them to leave and yet maintains a lot of the benefits, especially in terms of economic relations, with what will still be their largest trading partner right on their doorstep. Then you have the added complication, and I'll let Orla probably mention this a little bit more, but of Ireland and the Northern Irish border. Really, if any other country were to decide to leave the EU, it would probably be a simpler conversation than the UK. Obviously, the political history, a strong US tie, and a strong US interest in maintaining peace in Northern Ireland is very evident. We gave evidence at Congress last year to a House Foreign Affairs Committee hearing on Brexit, and actually, I would say 75% of the questions that we got were actually about the peace implications of if Brexit goes wrong, or if there's actually a border reimposed, or what could happen. And I think that's really enlightening to me, because that's not really what we're so focused on, but I think from a US political perspective, it's one of the things that the US government is actually really concerned about. Frankly, I don't think that the US government has involved itself very much, if at all, in this process, which maybe is for the best. We don't want to pick sides. We need to have a good relationship with the UK as well as with the EU. But I think by standing to the side and not even emphasizing the point that we want them to keep getting along, we might have missed an opportunity there. Because one of the real challenges for business and foreign policy is if Brexit goes so poorly and there actually isn't a withdrawal agreement at all, it's going to poison the well of trust between Brussels and London for a very long time. And these are two, obviously NATO partners. There's France and the UK are on the Security Council. Like, there's real problems if there's a sort of not amicable divorce here. So, I think we can get into a little bit more of a discussion later. But I just wanted to mention the overall impact of Brexit on U.S. business could be quite intense because of the nature of our investments in the UK and how a lot of companies use the UK to access the broader market. That's also true in reverse. As I'm sure many of you know, we have a lot of investments, especially in the tech sector in Ireland, and they are using that to get into the UK market in some examples. Or we work with MetLife, for example, whose EU headquarters is in Dublin, and they actually need to be able to continue accessing the large market of the UK. So it's actually a two-way relationship. We want to see this move forward, hopefully sooner rather than later, because we're now less than 5 months away from Brexit Day, which is a little frightening. And with that in mind, we're actually taking a delegation of 15 companies from our US-UK Business Council to Brussels and London at the end of this month now to talk with European officials and British officials. Our hope was actually to encourage them to sign a withdrawal agreement I think now it might be actually warning them of the consequences of not signing a withdrawal agreement and what a no-deal Brexit would mean in terms of some specific company-specific anecdotes from different sectors. So it's a challenging time. We don't know what it's going to look like, as none of us do. And I think the companies basically are ready to just know what the end result will be so that they can prepare for it. So thanks again for having me, and definitely looking forward to a broader conversation.
So hi everyone, I'm Orla. So I'm a privacy data security attorney here at Womble. But to give you a little bit of background, I was born in Dublin. My parents are Irish. I have since married someone from Ireland who's actually, family is from Northern Ireland. But I grew up here in Durham, so I have many North Carolina ties, and I work just down the hallway. So I think most of my comments right now will be on the impact on privacy and data, but I am happy from a personal point of view to talk about the border and what that may mean, and do have some insight on that as someone who travels to and from Ireland and Northern Ireland regularly. But from my perspective, when I think about Brexit and the clients that I represent, which span a lot of industries, but I would say a little bit heavy on tech, what does this mean for data? Data has to cross borders in order to run your business, whether it's your employee data, if your employees across the EU and in the UK, whether it's customer data. And so right now, I'm sure, is GDPR, I think we've all heard about, and I don't want to turn this into a GDPR panel, but for me that's been the focus. How does GDPR work post-Brexit? And so GDPR, it was interesting. I think a year ago a lot of the questions were, well, okay, we're in the UK, we're a UK organization, or we're a US company that regularly deals with UK customers. Do we even need to worry about GDPR because Brexit? And all the advice is, yes, you do have to worry about it, because there's this sort of awkward timing where the GDPR goes into effect of May of this year, and the UK is still part of the EU, and so the GDPR is the privacy law of the land then. So the focus for the UK companies that I represent has been compliance with GDPR. I don't want to say everyone's fully compliant, but let's start our GDPR compliance program. As everyone knows, it's been a huge amount of work, lots of resources, lots of time. So let's get compliant with the GDPR. And the UK has been fully committed to the GDPR. The UK has implemented a national law which implements the GDPR, and the UK, from my perspective, has been very much in the lead and being very active in giving guidance on how to implement the GDPR, daily guidance on Twitter and on their website, and have been very, very committed to the GDPR. And so that has been the focus, I would say, for my clients is let's comply with the GDPR. And in terms of what's going to happen with Brexit, there's been a lot of let's wait and see. And so we've been kind of doing business as usual. In terms of data flow, in terms of our data obligations, we're just going to comply with the GDPR. I would say now that's starting to shift a little bit as it gets closer. There's a lot of concern now about, well, wait a second, when the UK leaves the EU, what's going to happen? And we really do have to talk and think about that, because I'll try to spare you some of the details, but under the GDPR, if you are an EU country, then you can share data across your borders. You don't really have to do anything else. You have to comply with the GDPR, of course, but data can go from France to Spain to Italy to Ireland, and you don't have to do anything else. If you're not in that club, if you're not in the EU, so if you're the US, if you're Canada, if you're soon to be the UK, then you can't just assume that you can transfer data across the borders. You can't do that without having some sort of mechanism in place. So as a US attorney, I'm very used to that being the scenario from a lot of my US clients. We can't just take data from Spain or from Ireland. We have to do something first. And there's a lot of mechanisms that you can choose from. One is the Privacy Shield, which is for US companies. You can certify, and then if you certify with the Privacy Shield and follow the principles, you can receive data from the EU. For countries like Canada, they have what's called an adequacy decision, which essentially the EU has said, we've done a very thorough investigation of Canadian privacy laws and Canadian practices, and we feel comfortable if information from individuals in the EU goes to Canada, because we feel that you're going to protect it adequately, the same way that we would protect it in Europe. So if companies in Canada are receiving data from the EU, they don't really have to do anything else, because Canadian privacy laws are sufficient. So the big question now is, well, what about the UK? How now can data go from Ireland into Northern Ireland? How can data go from Spain into the UK? And when I say data, I'm mostly focusing on personal data, but remember that personal data under the EU is someone's first name. It's, you know, I haven't yet met a company that doesn't have personal data. And so the big question for the UK is, how is data going to flow? And data has to flow in order for companies to do business. And so I would say that's been the focus from my perspective. And I think I'll probably save for the second question where I think that, you know, some possible scenarios and how that could get resolved, or some of the worst case and best case scenarios.
Well, very good. So my name is Andrew Terrell, and I know you can tell from my accent you're thinking, that boy ain't British. What is he doing here? So I was born in Hickory, North Carolina, so I'm a native originally, but I spent a lot of time in Japan and then spent about a decade or so in the UK, started my first company there, came back, been in the US now for about 5 or so years, I guess it's been, my goodness. Can't believe I have to pay for healthcare now. It's really sad. But anyway, so we opened our office here in North Carolina about a year and a half ago, almost 2 years now, actually. And it was part of the UK expanding its diplomatic presence. Now, believe it or not, that decision was made before Brexit. So we had seen that more was happening at the state level, less was happening at the federal level. And I think that the embassy and our diplomatic network recognized that we needed to be engaged more at the state level. And we were not able to cover states like North Carolina as well as we should from our consulate in Atlanta and from the embassy in DC. So that's one of the reasons why we're here. The other reason is because of how important the North Carolina-UK relationship is to our broader diplomatic initiatives. So we have a lot of relationships in tech, in pharma. We have seen UK companies like McLaren and others expand their headcount in North Carolina. And when you look at the sectors that Britain sees as critical for its future, we're talking everything from tech, life sciences, electronic entertainment, creative industries, automotive engineering, advanced engineering, manufacturing. Those are areas where I think North Carolina excels. And I say that as native as well as a representative of HMG. And so I'm very proud to be back in my home state representing my home away from home. So coming to the topic at hand with Brexit. So the initial question that was given to me was kind of what is at stake with Brexit? And so I think I'll be fairly frank in saying that there is a lot at stake. I think that the Prime Minister is committed to delivering on the referendum from 2016. And what is at stake there in delivering that referendum? It's really the political legitimacy of our democratic system. We see that as critical. So I think I would agree with some of the other colleagues in that I don't see a way forward for a second referendum. That being said, you can't completely count it out. We shouldn't count anything out, knowing politics has been the way it has for the last several years. But we're very committed to delivering on a Brexit and a deal that works for our business partners as well as for the citizens who voted to retain control of their borders and protect their jobs and economic security. So I think that that's part of the second thing that is at stake for the UK is overall, where is our economy going? What do we want to lay the groundwork for? What does this mean in terms of our relationship with our key partners, including the EU and the United States? And also, how do we ensure that our citizens that they feel comfortable with our relationship with the European Union and others? Because there was a lot of that discomfort that I think made its way into the referendum and the Brexit campaign. The other thing that is important to us and what is at stake is the integrity of the United Kingdom, and coming back to the Northern Irish issue. So I think that we've made tremendous success in kind of going through this process. It has been slow, we've missed a lot of deadlines, but that's what happens in politics. You don't get a budget through without missing a few deadlines apparently these days. That's true in the US Congress, it's true in Brussels, and it's true in London. And so from where we were post-referendum, when there was a lot of gloom and doom scenarios and people were saying that this was going to collapse and everything, the moon was going to turn to blood and it's going to be like Revelation. It didn't exactly pan out. That didn't happen. And why is that the case? Well, that's because I think a lot of businesses were smart in that they saw that they needed to see where things were going. They kind of had a little bit of cautious optimism. But they're also going to hedge, so they're going to open boilerplate operations in other places, in Dublin and in Rotterdam and in Frankfurt, et cetera, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to do for businesses when there's that kind of uncertainty. So I think that coming back to the Northern Irish issue, I have been significantly comforted by my conversation with Ambassador Mulhill, who's the Irish ambassador to the United States, a few weeks ago, who visited the Triangle, and by what I'm getting from my political masters in London on what Brussels, London, Dublin, how they're talking about this issue. So there is a recognition that this is a very special case, and there is a recognition that we do not want to fall back into the 90s. And there is a recognition that the peace process, even though it's come quite a far way, you don't know what could necessarily disturb it. And there is no appetite in Brussels, Dublin, or London for there to be any uncertainty on that. The PM is committed, London is committed, Dublin is committed, and Brussels is committed. I think even to some case where if things don't go quite the way we would like, there would still be some special understanding, and there would be a unique kind of implementation and transition period that we could all agree to for the Northern Irish Board. I believe that there is an ability and a willingness on the part of Brussels, London, and Dublin to negotiate that and to be very vocal and active. I know that Dublin communicates to Brussels, we don't want to have a hard border, you need to do whatever we need to do to ensure that doesn't happen. London is, we're not going to stand for that at all, it's not going to happen. And Brussels is, okay, I understand this is a very unique case and we need to tread lightly and make sure that we come out with the best scenario. So we look at that as a territorial issue, integrity issue for the UK, and as the importance of the peace process. So we are committed to that. We don't know exactly what all the details will be on it, but we are committed to making sure that we define those details during the implementation phase, if not before. And before we agree what the final structure of that implementation phase will be, which is kind of what's being discussed now and why this is so important. Because Dublin wants reassurances at the end of the implementation phase, we are in a good place, and they want those legal assurances. And we completely understand that, and we will do whatever needs to be done to make sure that they have that. It's going to be an ongoing process, but we're 95% there. We're 95% there. And then the last thing, what's at stake, is how the UK is seen internationally and what the opportunities are for Brexit. So, of course, there's a lot of uncertainty, and there are a lot of risks associated with Brexit, but there's also a lot of opportunities. So the UK sees Brexit as its way of kind of restoring its place in the global trading system to kind of what it's historically been. I mean, the UK has always kind of had one foot in Europe and one foot out. It's always been this kind of unique exception. It's always tried to play this very unique role. And so that means setting us up to have a constructive future partnership, both economic and security, with Europe, but also looking at opportunities for free trade agreements not only with the United States, which is our priority, and we, in the president and his advisors' words, are kind of, first in the queue there. We're very pleased for that, and we've had a very good, we had last year a very good meeting with President Trump and Prime Minister May, and we're very confident that the White House understands our needs and that we will progress on that agreement after the implementation phase starts, where we can actually start negotiating this. We can't yet, but we can after March. So with that, we're also looking at countries such as Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, some countries which we wouldn't have been able to negotiate these agreements had we stayed in the European Union. So we're looking to kind of build a very unique, what we've been calling Global Britain. I'm not going to ask you to buy the branding, but what we're calling Global Britain, where we have a single market of goods and we maintain as much regulatory convergence, especially on GDPR, like Orla was saying, which we're very committed to, that we maintain that with the European Union, and then specifically on services with countries like the United States, because the UK and the US are the two top service exporting countries in the world, that we make sure we create as many opportunities for those service exporters as possible. So that's kind of what we're aiming to do with Global Britain, and what I think is at stake with this. So it's a lot that's at stake, but I think there's a lot of opportunities as well as risks, and I think that this whole process, while you hear a lot about it in the media, there's been a lot of gloom and doom. The gloom and doom didn't come true. Has there been a lot of uncertainty? Is there a lot of political pressure? Yes, of course. But we have agreed to the rights of EU citizens and UK citizens going back and forth, at least through the implementation period. We've agreed to a financial settlement. We've gotten through our withdrawal agreement, about 90-95%. Really, the outstanding issues for us are about the Northern Irish border, and we recognize that that's of critical importance. But I will say that over the last 4 or 5 months, seeing the discussions between Brussels and Dublin and London, I think we're all confident that everyone actually finally understands how important this issue is, which maybe at the beginning of the process, it didn't get enough attention. But I think now, certainly, it is getting that attention. So.
And I don't know if it would be helpful, and this may be obvious to many, but just understanding when we talk about the border that, 20 years ago, if you were getting from Dublin to Belfast, you had to go through a border.
Hard check.
Now you won't even know when you're crossing the border. People in Dublin go up to get dental work done in the north because it's cheaper. Some people from the north come down to buy wine because it's cheaper. So you just go back and forth, and you wouldn't even know that you're crossing the border. So just to make sure people kind of understand that conceptually when we talk about the border between the two, and then of course with trade, when there's no border, that's a lot easier to drive back and forth for companies that have. Think about workers. There's lots of people who work in Ireland or live in Ireland and work, just 10 miles north, and now how they have to go through customs every day to get to their job. So when we talk about the border, that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, there was a clip that one of the news might have been BBC or someone else that was talking about the border and what does that mean, and they had a dog and the dog kind of went over the fence. He's in Northern Ireland. Now he's in the Republic of Ireland, and that's how easy it is now, as opposed to I don't think Ollie, I think was the dog's name, would have had an easiest time back during the early 90s.
Yeah, 20 years ago, it's just like whenever you enter another country, you would have to go through and show documents and your car check. So it's very, very different. I mean, I remember going through the border 20 years ago versus now when we drive back and forth, we don't even know we're going through a border. So it's just a very different experience.
I've read that I think the ingredients for a Guinness cross the border 6 times every time. Or the cow grazing in the pasture will cross back and forth. So they're going to have, if you think about we have a free trade agreement still, thankfully, with Canada and Mexico. We still have borders between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. So it's, I think, a little bit short-sighted on everyone's part so far about just this idea that as soon as the UK and the EU sign a free trade agreement, it will cover everything it needs to cover to ensure that there's no border in Ireland and Northern Ireland. They have one advantage, clearly, is there's something called the common travel area, so there's no need for people to be checked between going from Ireland to Northern Ireland. Sort of like when you go to the EU and you're in the Schengen area, you don't even have to show a passport. When you go from France to Spain, there's just a sign that says E, and now you're in Spain, or a sign that says F, and now you're in France. So it's sort of like that in Ireland and Northern Ireland, so you don't have the people checks. But you're going to need to have sort of regulatory consistency in things like agriculture and goods, because otherwise someone from the US could sell something that maybe is now legal in 20 years in the UK, but it's not necessarily made to the same standard as in the EU, and if there's no border, there's a risk there of at least what the EU would consider some dumping problems. So that this trade agreement has to be a really strong trade agreement, which will inevitably put some limits of some kind on what the US and UK can do ourselves if indeed, and we hope, that they're able to conclude such an arrangement between the UK and the EU to ensure that border remains seamless.
And that's why an agreement between the US and the UK will probably focus tremendously on services, because there are the issues, like you said, with goods, and also in the UK there's a number of political concerns about things like chlorinated chicken and GMOs and all this sort of stuff, which will no doubt come up in one of our upcoming British American Business Council events. There you go, it's a plug, Steve. Next year.
A-Rate's involvement and Bayer as well.
Exactly. So tune in next year for that. But quickly on the point of regulatory convergence as well. So the UK's approach on this is that basically, and this has been part of a number of omnibus bills that have been going through Parliament, is that we will start with complete regulatory convergence with the EU, and that we will look for opportunities to slowly diverge where it makes sense and doesn't affect supply chains and doesn't affect our business partners. And so I can't stress this more than enough. If you have any concerns with any of your supply chains in the US for UK FTA or in Europe, please share them with me. Share your concerns. It's a huge part of my job, is listening to businesses and taking your feedback. And I know back in 2017, when I first took up this role, a lot of it was about talent recruitment, more so than supply chains, because companies. There was an A&D company that we spoke to, and they said, okay, well, Brexit worst case scenario, we're forecasting half a fraction of percent increased cost on this part of our supply chain. But what really annoys us is that we have some C-suite level folks and main managers we want to hire from other European countries, and they're not sure they want to bring their families into the UK now because they don't know what their work status will be. That was why one of the first things we agreed to, one of the major breakthroughs that we had last year around Christmas, was to agree through the implementation phase that if UK companies hire folks and they bring them into the UK, they'll be able to stay there on their visas and they can bring their families. And they can live there without that kind of uncertainty, because we realized that was having an immediate material effect on recruitment. And so listening to them and taking that input and feeding it back into London is something that I can help all of you do if you have any of those concerns. And even if you have London operations and you've touched base with our life sciences organizations or others, please also let me know as well, because the more vectors of attack we have in getting business input into this process, I think the better it will be. I think there's no better advocacy for doing this proper right than the business community, and that's because they have the data, and that's because they have the relationships, and they know, because it affects their bottom line at the end of the day, how these things might affect their operations going forward. So I know I've seen a lot of information from some of our life science partners in London, and it wasn't immediately appreciated, I think, how that data was a really good bargaining chip for us in our negotiations, and should be part of our the information that our team had when we went to Brussels. And so I think that the more information you guys have and can share with us, and the more opinions you have and you can share with us, and the more input we can get from businesses into this process will be very helpful, and not just in Washington, but here at the state level as well. So in looking towards our relationship with the EU and the effects that might have, both positive and negative, and also a potential US one, please feel free to get in touch with me and to pass that information on, because I will make sure that it gets seen and that it gets paid attention to both in Washington and in London.
That's a great segue to the next question. Andrew's kind of already addressed a little bit of it, but my next topic or question was to ask the panel to share what industries and issues they really feel are most affected by Brexit. So we've built this as a business session, but obviously we have a lot of diversity of companies here. So I'm going to ask you all, and you've already spoken to a little bit in reference, but what industries do you feel are really going to be most affected by Brexit and whatever outcome you predict? And that will, of course, lead up to our final question, but what industries do you really feel are the ones to watch that might be most affected, and maybe why?
Well, sure. Well, I think for one thing, as Orla mentioned, everyone needs data. So if there's no agreement on data, everyone will be affected enormously. So I think that is one overarching issue. From our membership, we see a fairly significant divergence between goods companies and services companies. If you're a Ford or a Procter & Gamble and your products are crossing the channel 3 or 4 times in the production process, you're very worried that if all of a sudden on March 2019th, you have to pay tariffs and wait at ports for customs checks and things 3 or 4 times both directions, that is going to cause you to rethink maybe your manufacturing strategy. Either you want to centralize some of it in the UK for the UK market and take some of it out for the EU market, or you have to figure out some other interim solution. Maybe you move more of it to a country like Canada or South Africa, who already has a free trade agreement with the EU, and you can do it from there. Maybe so you might see some moving investments in the goods sector if there's no transition period and no FTA, at least initially. And I think the most obvious impact of Brexit in the immediate term will be at places like ports, airports, just in terms of there isn't the infrastructure to handle this. If you're a UK company who only exports to the EU right now, you've never done a customs form in your life. I think that the adjustment for small companies especially will be huge. I think most of the companies that we work with, the larger, mid-sized and larger companies, have the ability to handle this. I mean, it will be more expensive, but we'll be able to survive, obviously, anything that comes out. But I think for small companies, they're not really thinking about it yet. I've seen studies even in the UK that only 30 or 40% of companies have a contingency plan at all. Obviously, even less of them are actually implementing them. So I think there's definitely a clear need, frankly, on all sides for there to be this transition period or implementation period. Same thing if you're a French or a Dutch company and you want to keep selling things to people in the UK. I mean, obviously the internet makes this so easy. You can create your website and have Google translate it. You don't even have to create an English language version, and it'll do it for you. Something like 95% of people on eBay, for example, are exporters. You don't even have to think about it. And FedEx or UPS will do all the paperwork for you generally anyway. So on goods, it's a little bit complicated. On services, I think companies will be able to handle this a little bit easier. For one thing, in financial services, obviously a huge sector in the UK and in the US, they've been thinking about how this is going to affect them since day one, and maybe even since during the referendum time, and have, like Andrew was saying, moved some of their people, but also some of their functionalities to different parts of the EU single market so that they obviously can continue servicing customers on day one under any scenario. And by the nature of their business, it's a little bit more fungible where they are physically and how they do that. And it helps, as we've also mentioned, that something like 80% of the US economy and 80% of the UK economy are services, so it makes things slightly easier. But yeah, certainly in the goods sector, there's a lot of possibility for some, especially short-term pain if there's no agreement in March.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to Garrett because you sort of hit on everything that I would think is important. For me, as a privacy attorney, it's companies that their business is data. So very tech data heavy companies are the ones that have been trying to implement some mechanisms and plan for this. I would say some US companies that just have presence in the UK, and that's where they've decided, especially if they're a services company, so they don't really need a physical presence in the UK, so they may not even have any employees in the UK, but that's where they've sort of set up their base in terms of, for privacy law, you have to usually identify sort of a local representative or a local authority that will be on the ground in Europe. If they've chosen the UK, then that has created some concerns about, okay, well actually I think maybe we need to pick a country elsewhere so that we also have an EU presence now. So that's, and that has tended to be a lot of the small companies, small to medium, or some startups who are trying to branch out to Europe. Now I think the discussion has changed a little bit where UK may have seen like a more obvious choice because English speaking and so many commonalities between the US and UK. And for many, I'm not saying it's no longer a choice by any means, but I do think now that has entered the conversation of, well, should we consider Dublin or consider somewhere else because of what's happening?
So I think coming back to financial services, so of course that is a huge component of the UK economy, not actually as large as some people think, but it does dominate the discussions quite early on, especially in London. So as I mentioned, some companies had started putting kind of boilerplate operations in other places, but there are a lot of factors that go into determining where they're going to actually put most of their headcount, which, you know, when you come down to it, is one of the key things for us because we want to make sure we're securing jobs in the UK as well. So two things on that. One, we're looking for a kind of unique arrangement on financial services and passporting with Europe, with the EU. And then two, if you look at the surveys that bank managers and financial companies, not only financial companies, but predominantly in London, when they ask their employees, you know, where you want to go if we're going to take you somewhere else in Europe, the answer is usually nowhere. They usually enjoy staying in London. So while depending on how things pan out, you may get some staff moving to different facilities and all this, we don't expect even really in the worst case scenario to have a massive exodus of financial companies. And also another reason for that, and this is where I also draw in the tech sector and the life sciences sector, is how London has just become such a huge hub for venture capital and for startups. London attracts more venture capital than the rest of Europe combined. And there's a huge community there that is very, very attractive. And we don't really see that going anywhere. We fully expect there to be other cities, including in Ireland and in Germany, that will kind of pitch themselves as competitors. And we expect them to get some business, and we welcome the competition. But I would say that just the massive amount of venture capital and the enthusiasm that general employees and companies have for staying in London, we're fairly comfortable that if we can come up with the right financial passporting relationship with the EU, that will be in a good place there. I'd also note we do need to see what's going on with the EMA in life sciences and healthcare. That's something that is on our radar and we appreciate, and that's somewhere where we may have to talk about a unique regulatory arrangement as well. But again, we're starting from a position of complete regulatory convergence with the UK and slowly diverging out. I think that's...
Andrew, you may just want to explain financial passporting for some not in the financial community.
Well, so, I don't want to get too bogged down in that. If you have questions on financial passporting, then please get in touch, because I don't know if we have any financial companies here.
Gary is.
Oh, okay.
But just domestic.
Just a minute. Oh, okay. All right. Well, if you have questions, we can talk about it after, but I want to make sure we can cover as much as possible.
Yeah, we do want to allow a little time for open discussion, but just one more question before we do open up. The last question I've asked, the panelists bravely agreed to answer this. It's a crystal ball question, which most people don't always love to answer, but I asked what they thought is the best and worst case scenario for a Brexit outcome if they had to predict, and also maybe if they want to mitigate those extremes and say what they think is the most likely of those.
Well, I mean, I think everyone is starting to realize just how complicated this is. I mean, we would have liked to have had them have this conversation earlier, frankly, because but as we've said, decisions at the political level, especially in Europe, come down to a lot of 2 in the morning European Council summits, maybe the 3rd or 4th summit, where eventually everyone decides, this is, and actually one of the challenges with Brexit is the rest of Europe has like so many other issues that they don't even want to think about Brexit. They're sort of annoyed with the UK for bothering them with this. They're like, all right, if you're leaving, just leave so we can make decisions on migration and security. And I mean, frankly, and now Italy, like there's a lot of challenges in Europe that they want to focus on, I think justifiably. And Brexit is sort of seen as a distraction in Brussels, whereas obviously when you go to London, it's sort of this all-encompassing conversation, which is actually one of the reasons there's some concern that this might go badly, because I think there is a misalignment of how concerned and how important this issue is to the EU versus to the UK. There's some very clear reasons for, I think, some optimism. One is the all sides really do agree on the need to avoid this Irish border. And another is, frankly, because of London's status as the sort of preeminent financial center in Europe, Europeans are still going to need access to this capital. Like there's a bilateral interest in having some sort of arrangement that works for everyone. I just think there's certainly a lot of minefields out there still. I mean, Theresa May is leading a party that is very divided on this issue and has been for a very long time. There are some people in the parliament who think Brexit is this like orthodoxy of like, we can't wait to be free, like good riddance to the EU, which is like a little bit dangerous when you're talking about people's livelihoods and their jobs. And eventually in 20 years, maybe this will all sort of smooth itself out. But we want to make sure that there's an actual way, a bridge, and that people are well taken care of in the meantime. And frankly, that U.S. investments are well taken care of in the meantime and continue to work well both in the UK and the EU. So I still think the most likely outcome is that they find an agreement that is basically on the EU's terms, because it's going to have to be. The UK is the one leaving. They don't get to decide, frankly, the rules that the EU is going to impose on them for future access to the market. I think the UK realizes that. That's why they're promoting this idea of a 2-year transition period where they essentially adopt all the rules without a vote and say, salute the flag, we're going to follow your regulatory policy. And frankly, I think their companies have insisted on this. In fact, our British counterpart, the Confederation of British Industry, has even gone further than that, asking for a customs union sort of in perpetuity, realizing that facilitating supply chains, especially in goods, is so important that it's actually even more important than having new trade agreements in goods for the UK after Brexit. And that, I don't know if we'll actually get to that, but I think that's the direction that things are pointing in. And I also think that if it comes down to a vote between no deal and a deal largely on the EU's terms that Theresa May is able to get, I think the Parliament will have to say, the chaos that will result from a no deal. I mean, we're talking about stockpiling medicine and hiring private boats to bring food over because the port of Calais is blocked. I mean, it's kind of crazy for the world's 5th largest economy in 2018 to be thinking about that. So I think the reality will force enough people to to follow this deal. But I mean, I still think there's some risks that doesn't actually happen.
Yeah, I think, worst case from a data privacy point of view is that the transition period ends and there's no agreement on what happens next. And if there's no agreement, then the UK is what's called a third country. They're outside of the EU, and data cannot travel out of the EU to the UK unless company by company they implement some mechanisms. You can enter into certain contract terms. You can do this internal process called where you get approval from the EU to share data. I don't think that is going to happen, and I hope that doesn't happen, because all of my clients have an interest in continuing to do the business that they're doing right now in the UK and outside the UK and between US, UK, EU. So I don't think that's going to happen. I think what my understanding is that there's been no substantive negotiations of what data sharing agreement would look like or what will happen. They're just not ready yet. The European Commission's not ready yet to do that. So no one knows what will happen. But if I had to guess, I think that what a lot of privacy attorneys are saying, well, we hope that during that transition period, the European Commission will find that UK is, I mentioned there's this adequacy decision, or essentially UK would get added to a list of, I think right now there's about 12 countries that are on it, saying that, look, your privacy mechanisms are adequate and data can go from the EU to the UK and there won't have to be anything more per se. So that's what I think would be a best case scenario. That's what I think would happen. And I imagine that so there's been some concern that the adequacy decision process takes years, and we don't 4 years maybe on average, and we don't have that amount of time. But I think given UK's implementation of the GDPR, its involvement in the GDPR and in the working party and now the board, I think that they're starting from a really good position. So I would hope that it would be a realistic that there would be an agreement on the data flow, which I think is very important.
So I broadly concur with everything that Garrett and Orla said. I would just say that I think the most likely outcome and how to expect things is that if we set a deadline, probably expect us to come to a solution a little bit after that. At this point, as I said, because of the conversations, I think early on last year we were talking primarily to business, looking at supply chain effects, looking at the economic partnership, and trying to understand what our negotiating position would really be with Europe, since I don't think a lot of people had anticipated the referendum would be successful. And that's why I think the Northern Irish issue didn't necessarily get all the attention that it deserved up front. But now that we've kind of concluded 90-95% of those broader discussions, we see that the details, which are going to have to be ironed out in the implementation phase, what do we need to get there? And then that last 5%-ish is making sure that we're clear on Northern Ireland. So I broadly agree with everything that Garrett and Orla said. I would say that a deal will come, and it will be a good compromise deal between the UK and the EU, but it will be subject to the political machinations of Parliament, and that's always a little bit of an uncertainty. But at the end of the day, we will have a deal. It will just probably come at the 11th hour or a little bit after, maybe. Yeah, the 13th hour, exactly.